promotion keeps prices down far more effectively.
As long as suffering of sentient being remain, I will remain in order to serve.
I imagined God like my grandfather.
In conversation this evening, my guest is a legend in his own time for having developed and promoted the Jaipur foot. But he's a man of many parts, we hope this interview will reveal. He's won the Magsaysay Award and numerous honors in India and abroad. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Dr. P.K. Sethi. Dr. Sethi, tell us, the Jaipur foot is now legend in our consciousness. You say the Jaipur foot and everybody immediately thinks of you and thinks of the pioneering work that you did with the Jaipur foot. What exactly is the Jaipur foot?
Well, you see, let me make it clear at the outset that I'm basically an orthopedic surgeon, and I don't craft the foot myself. But as an orthopedic surgeon, we are required to look after patients who have lost their limbs, and having lost their limbs, then one has to have a limb substitute. So an artificial limb has to be provided. Now, when I started my career in orthopedics in Jaipur, way back in 1958, there were no workshops in the whole of North India where artificial limbs were available. So, after having amputated a limb for various reasons, or an amputee coming over to us, we would advise them to go over to the Army Limb Center at Pune. The first sort of thing which impelled me to move into this area was to see that we should be able to provide limbs at our own place. Because if we advise somebody to travel a long way to Pune, only the affluent could manage this, but the poor were completely left out. And after all, they form the bulk of our patients. So it was a question of a local facility being set up. And the design that we used was inevitably a copy of the Pune limb, which in turn was a copy of the London limb, because it was inherited from the British Army. And it was a good limb, and Pune still maintains its tradition of making extremely good limbs. And this is what we try to follow.
When you say a good limb, what does that mean?
Means that the craftsmanship, the workmanship, and everything is very good.
You now read about things like a bionic arm.
That's a different ball game altogether. You see, in fact, we chose as our priority the replacements of lower limbs. Because without, if your limb is lost, you can't move around without the help of crutches. But if your arm is lost and you have the other arm working, then people learn to manage to use one arm and get along.
Even in terms of the lower limb, there are obviously different levels of efficiency that it can give you. Your foot is famous. It's being used by a dancer, someone who puts this on and dances.
No, there are two components to it. You see, one is the fact that when we started using the Western design, and I thought we were making fairly good sort of products. At that point of time, Jaipur was a small town. And when you went out on the streets, you recognized people, people recognized you. It was easy for a doctor to spot out his patients and vice versa. And in any case, it was easy enough to spot out an amputee. So I would see a person walking around on crutches, and I've seen he's lost his limb. And then I look at his face and I say, but we had provided him with a limb. Why is he using crutches? So I'll stop, I'll get down and talk to him. And my apprehension was that probably something had gone wrong with the limb. It was not fitting well, it had broken down. But the feedback which came, and it came back again and again and again, was that the limb that we had provided them allowed them to walk on level ground comfortably, but it made it compulsory for them to wear a pair of shoes. Without shoes, that western limb could not be used. They could not sit on the floor because because we are habitually floor-sitting people culturally. And in fact, if you go around, you see all the warm countries in the world, this is the culture. While in the colder climates of Europe or North America, you have to move away from the floor, you have to sit on a chair, then a table becomes a work surface, and life revolves around furniture. They have paved roads on which they walk, and they have to protect their feet from cold by wearing warm socks and closed shoes. But we ourselves dislike wearing closed shoes, except for formal occasions. The first thing we do when we come back home is to kick off the shoes and heave a sigh of relief. And here we are making it compulsory for the amputee to wear the shoes all the time. Now, every time he entered home, culture demanded that he should take his shoe off, which means taking the limb off. Our women won't use shoes. You couldn't enter places of worship, like in a mandir or a masjid or a gurdwara, wearing shoes. So every time the limb was required to be taken off. And the culprit every time was the footpiece. Because the Western footpiece was made to be covered by a shoe which concealed its shape, and there was no reason for it to be very durable because the shoe was protecting it. But the moment you take the shoe off, the oddness of its shape appears, the fragility of its structure comes out, and so therefore you have to completely...
So the major change was that
was
you
in the design of the
integrated,
footpiece. One was the appearance, because the shoe is off and so it should look like a foot. The other was that it should have enough mobility to allow our people to squat on the floor or sit cross-legged on the floor or walk on uneven terrain in our rugged countryside and so on. So which means a lot of adaptability. Now this mobility was not provided in the Western footpiece. So initially my entire sort of idea was very largely based on these properties and how to incorporate them into the footpiece.
You're a surgeon by training,
yes,
and a physician by aspiration.
Yeah.
And here you were working in an area that wasn't really a part of your specialization, in a sense.
No.
What drove you, what motivated you into transcending your primary skills?
No, you see, there was a background to it, because if you have seen the work of an orthopedic surgeon, his work is not finished after merely treating a fracture, applying a plaster cast, or operating. After that, there's a whole process of rehabilitation. For that, you need departments like the physiotherapy department. Now, we had in our institution no physiotherapy department. This requires some simple basic equipment, a walking aids like parallel bars, some exercise weights and pulleys and things like these. And every time I placed a demand for this to the administration, you see, this was all knocked down, because these were not important, these were trivial. What the institution wanted was either something which is life-saving or something which will really enhance its prestige in society. We've got a very fancy equipment. Having failed to get across the administration, then I had no option but to get these things made locally by local artisans and craftsmen, using our patients as donors. And that some patient will donate wood, somebody will say, all right, hire a carpenter, I'll pay his week's wages. And so gradually I got a lot of equipment for physiotherapy made like that.
So this
introduced me to interact with this class of people, because to be able to talk to them, you have to sit down with them, watch them at work, learn something of their jargon, And then you start developing a certain admiration for their skills and innovation. And so this is the group I turn to.
So in a sense that even though you were within what people would normally consider a restrictive, inhibitive government hospital structure, you were able to reach out beyond it, work with the community, and develop something.
A lot
that
of
was relevant to
community
that.
support. Later on, even in my limb work, you see, if you require simple raw materials, now you send your demand over, and then it has to be processed. And ultimately, all kinds of audit objections and things like these and so on. It was very difficult to get things going. But then if you get to the community and they buy the raw materials and give it over to you, then you bypass the system.
Talking about the system, and as I mentioned earlier, that you've had this interest and aspiration to be a physician, which really means looking at the patient as a total human being, and not just as someone who's got a disembodied part of his body, or in a very limited sense. Are you despairing at the way that modern medicine, with its over-specialization, is developing now, that we stop looking at the human being behind the disease?
I genuinely am. I voiced my concerns on several occasions, and I see things going wrong with what was formerly a healing profession being congealed into something which is purely technical or even market-driven.
In what ways would you say that it's now? I mean, we seem to think that with the improvement of instrumentation and MRI and CAT scans and microsurgery, that we have somehow been able to improve the quality of medical care.
Well, they have their role, but you see, after all, a patient is a human being. He not only has a physical ailment, he is also a bundle of emotions which have been affected by his physical ailment. And the doctor, if it is a healing profession, has to look after both sides. So you can never ignore the patient. Now, what has happened is that we claim that, as contrasted with traditional systems of medicine, which were very largely looking at the person as an individual, as a human being, because they had nothing much else to offer, we said we are becoming scientific, and we use science as a tool for medicine, and science relies on objectivity, in measurement, in quantifying things, and so you start doing that. Because when a person cries, of his cry of despair, of his pain and anguish and so on, I mean, these are, you can't easily quantify them. So you consider these as noises. They distract you from the major thing, which is to measure. And that's why all these laboratory gadgetry, X-rays, CT scans and MRI and what have you, these allowed you to objectify things. But then, as Ashish Nandi once very perceptively pointed out, in this process what you have done is that you reduce a human being to certain physical quantities. And then you reconstruct a patient out of those physical quantities, and you are treating that image. Not a human being.
But what is the cost, at the apparent level? One would argue and say that we today have better medical facilities than we had in the past. People have fewer diseases, or different kinds of diseases, are certainly living longer, and certainly in terms of the physical quality of their lives, things have improved. So what's wrong?
I think a lot of change which has occurred about, say, when you talk of longevity, when you talk of better health, whatever that means, non-medical factors have played a larger role than medical factors. You see, it is good nutrition, it is hygiene, it is social cohesion, and all these things, better housing, better water supply, which really in a major way, change the scenario. Now, we might sort of say that it's the medical profession which has been responsible. This is not so. It has been shown repeatedly that, like the death rates from tuberculosis were reduced almost 15 times what they were in 1850 before streptomycin ever came on this scenario. So the first effective chemical agent, medicine which could act on the tubercle bacillus, well, already these other measures had done that.
Earlier on you were talking about how a patient is also a bundle of emotions.
Yes.
Well, science now sort of suggests to us that those bundles of emotion are nothing but biochemical changes in the brain. And we can use drugs to change that biochemistry of the brain and change his emotions. So what's the problem?
See, here we are getting on to areas about which we do not really know. Let us confess that although we know much more than what we knew a generation ago, our sort of ignorance far exceeds our knowledge. There are a large number of things we do not know. The thing that you are talking about is the view, which is the Cartesian view, that human body is just a machine. If you know how the machine works, you can always set it right. I think very keen intellects in the field of medicine are questioning this. There's this whole issue of body-mind relationship. What is the influence of mind on body? In Cartesian medicine, mind doesn't enter the equation at all. But here, that's a very important attribute. And the fact is, we should be knowing more about it, probing more about it. You have the example of Roger Sperry, a famous neurophysiologist from California, who got a Nobel Prize for demonstrating that thought changes matter. It's something which formerly was not conceivable.
Tell me, in the field that you're in, someone whose arm has been amputated or leg has been amputated is sometimes able to feel the presence or the pain or sensation. Why does that?
That is what you call a phantom limb. That is, every time you amputate a limb, for a certain amount of time, the image of that limb lingers on in the mind. There is the body image, and as a very curious way in which it gradually disappears. It is very funny if you ask patients, well, how much of it you are feeling? They say, my foot is here, my knee is here, and my hip is here, but in between the leg and thigh are gone. And then the knee will disappear, then the foot is close to the hip, then the foot will disappear. So there is a certain manner in which this body image tends to disappear. We call this a phantom limb.
What does this tell us about the relationship between the mind?
No, this has something to do with memory. Again, and there's a whole lot of work going on memory mechanisms. How is it that we remember something of our early childhood? And there's a long-term memory and a short-term memory, and the long-term memory is much stronger than the short-term memory. We don't really know. And the interesting thing is that sometimes this phantom limb becomes painful, and the patient cries, and we feel very helpless. We say, the limb doesn't exist and this fellow is crying. And no amount of persuasion will do anything. We are still at sea.
So how do you treat that? Do you treat that with painkillers? Does it numb the sensation of pain, or is it purely psychological and painkillers?
No, there are new theories of pain which are emerging, which are much stronger than the earlier theories. One of the things in vogue is what you call a gate control theory of pain, and there you can modulate pain. The pain impulses may reach your brain, but the brain will not perceive it as pain, and you can invoke these tracks to stimulate them. Like for instance, you have electrical currents doing this, and you invoke those particular tracks, and it kind of blocks the gate. So the pain impulses can't go up.
So it's taking this idea of relationship to pain and extending that to relationship to suffering and a philosophy of life and how we relate to suffering and our acceptance of suffering in some philosophies, our rejection of it in others. I think that Gandhiji was someone who was working this whole strategy of exposing yourself to pain in the cause of asserting your commitment to truth, to right, to what was appropriate. You have written about and talked about Gandhi's vision of health care, in how that might manifest itself in social structures. Do you still see that as being compatible with modern technologies and techniques of
In fact,
healthcare?
it's not only compatible, it has now become imperative.
In what ways?
That we should not forget the basic lessons. You see, we are so enchanted with modern technology. You walk into an operating room where, say, open heart surgery is being done. You look at oscilloscopes, you look at heart-lung machines, you look at all kinds of gadgetry going on. I mean, the visual impact is so strong that you are literally swept off your feet. You say, look, where have we arrived? I mean, this is science fiction medicine. But at no point of time does the idea occur to you, what is it these people are trying to do? Say they're doing a coronary bypass. Why do coronary arteries get choked? They don't know. I mean, instead of trying to understand the basic causes of disease mechanism,
Well, I'll be told
you got completely
that's
caught
because
up.
I eat fatty foods and I
Every 5 years this theory changes. Our people have eaten ghee and milk for centuries, and what has it done to them? I think we are taking, you see, it's a multifactorial problem. And we look at one side of it, and suddenly cholesterol becomes the
villain. Yes.
the villain. And then somebody comes across and says, oh, there's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. So let's increase our good cholesterol and get rid of the bad cholesterol. And so every 5 years things keep on changing. I mean, which I'm not making a mockery of it, but this is how it should be as long as you are questioning existing knowledge. This is what Karl Popper, the great philosopher of science, always said, that there is nothing like absolute truth, and that every experiment which is designed in science should be falsifiable. This is falsifiability theory. And so it's not something which is handed down to us from above and you can't question it. You question everything. But then as a result of that, you get into all this kind of confusion. Well, out of this confusion also emerges a larger truth.
So, what is this larger truth in the sense that the World Health Organization says health for all by the year 2000?
You see, I mean, you know and I know that that's a populist slogan. You can't have that kind of slogan in an unjust world. Even in our own country, you have the top 10% of elite. We have a very stratified society. Bottom 90% of the urban rural poor. Well, it's the top 10% which create what you call a technology demand. They are the decision makers, they are the policy makers, and all our science and technology institutes are geared towards meeting their needs.
So what would
about
be your ideal? I mean, what could we mean by health for all? So we never have infections, we never have diseases, and
No, I mean,
so we're born and we grow old and we just sort of die natural deaths from old age?
You see, after all, death is inevitable. I mean, if there's one thing certain in life, that it's, if you are born, you will die. And to try to put off death at any cost, I mean, there is a limit to it. Untimely death, of course, is, or avoidable death certainly should be avoided. But as you grow old, you will die. Otherwise, how will the new generation come in? There's an irrevocable law of nature. But we are trying to play God. We say, we'll protect you. will not allow you to die, and you have an ICU, intensive care unit, and then, you know, as a house surgeon, when we saw a patient is doomed to die, we had to show that we are doing something. We used to inject Coramin, and as a last resort, we would put in a needle in the heart and inject a little adrenaline, and then the patient will die, and the patients will say, "Doctor साहब ने बहुत मेहनत की, अब इसको कौन बचा सकता?"
But there are occasions when the patient survives.
But today, very few. But today, the same thing is being done in a far more expensive manner in an intensive care unit.
But could you, if there was someone close to you, or me, you know, a 21-year-old person, and in intensive care, could you restrain yourself from doing everything you could to save their life?
You see, this is what you call the technological imperative. And where you say, well, if something can be done, it should be done, irrespective of what it costs. Now, you will find that the cost-benefit ratio will keep on diminishing. There is a law of diminishing returns. There is a flat of the curve medicine. And then you find that increasing inputs will not give you the...
But you know, for the human being whose dear one is about to lose his life, there's no cost-benefit ratio, it's any cost.
You are trying to save one life when hundreds of lives elsewhere in the downtrodden are being totally ignored. Now, if you have a restricted amount of money available to you, where are you going to put it? And I would put my money on basic research, which will give us better understanding. That really is high technology medicine. This science fiction medicine is not high technology. I mean, just because you are using technology from other disciplines, and therefore you think that your own medicine has become high technology, it is not. Discovery of vitamins was a high technology medicine. Discovery of hormones was a high technology medicine. The moment you understand the basic disease mechanism, and then you can turn it around. You see, the treatment immediately becomes far more effective, much less expensive. And that is high technology. It is where you don't understand that you resort to all this kind of complicated gimmickry.
Dr. Sethi, thank you very much indeed. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.